Well, good evening. What a nice hall full of people. You're part of what is happening in this country, as you know, and many countries, people engaged in their communities and knowing we can do better than we're doing. What I have to say tonight it's not very pretty. You already know it. I'm going to demonstrate quite clearly what is happening in what is in jargon called socio-spatial restructuring. And all that means is that sometimes people talk about what's happening socially in a city to people and all that. Here we combine social and spatial, where those social changes live. Everybody, except for homeless people, sadly, live someplace, and whatever's happening to our country, to the population is unfolding someplace. And here I focus on a number of very big cities, the 4 biggest metropolitan areas. So go forward. So I am very pleased to have this opportunity. I never did meet Warren Gill when I was here at UBC in the 1980s. Of course, knew of him, and then I was very impressed with the fact that somebody had the idea that a university out on a peninsula and a university on a mountaintop is sort of nice, but there's a big city here, and maybe more should be happening as it is now, thanks to him and many people like him. My longtime colleague and a former professor, Larry Bourne, I think all geographers will know Larry Bourne, a retired professor from the University of Toronto, knew Warren really well, and he sent these few words to me, expressing his deep respect for Warren as a scholar, a teacher, and as an individual. His energy, wit, and insightful barbs were an inspiration to many colleagues and friends, and this is it's fitting that we have this lecture series here at SFU, so that's very nice. A few years back, without knowing it, my colleague from the University of Toronto, Mark Kingwell, partly made a preface to my presentation here. His talk is online for this lecture series here. I recommend that you watch it if you haven't. He spoke on public space as a public good and talked about, in effect, justice in the city. What is a just city? And part of it talked about the growing inequality, and you see one of my maps there that he used for that little segment, little part of his much larger talk there. So it's a bit of an introduction to what I'll be talking about tonight here. Now, neighborhoods are changing. Cities have always had high-income areas and low-income areas. A number of us got together 2003, 2004. At the time, we used the word gentrification. Now, gentrification is one kind of neighborhood change. As you probably all know, more or less low-income areas being increasingly settled by higher-income people and sometimes dramatically changing the geography and displacing the people there. But there are many other kinds of neighborhood change. We don't have names for all of them, actually. So what we set out to do and have continued doing is these 4 things. We want to identify what the trends are in terms of how our cities are changing. And then you want to try to explain why. So that's the processes of why it's happening. What are the consequences and what can be done about it, policy and program options. So tonight I do demonstrate trends with an emphasis on Vancouver. I do talk about the processes. The consequences need a lot more research, and we have a good sense of what some of the consequences are in general. And I do mention a number of, again, if we know what's causing it, we know what we should try to get at to change that. We have great funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Canada. It's our tax dollars here. A couple of large social science grants. And we have research teams in those 7 Canadian metropolitan areas. So these are 4, 5, 6, 7, depends. academics in each city with 4 or 5 various partners. The United Way in every one of those cities is a partner, as in Vancouver here. And then the Social Planning Council here and Social Planning and Research Council here is a partner. And so it's called a partnership grant. And we first identify the trends, and then we try to figure out what the processes are. Now, this research began with, as a base, the 2 key national income trends that you see there mentioned. One is the growing gap between the rich and poor. So that's income inequality, the growing gap, income inequality. The other is the fact that there are fewer middle-income households, which then means there's fewer middle-income neighborhoods. And that's polarization. So income inequality, income polarization are related, but they're 2 different things. Polarization, by the word poles, it means simply there's more people at the top, at the high-end income pole, and of course now way more at the bottom, and the middle is much smaller. So I don't use the term middle class. You hear that a lot. And the only reason is it's a perfectly good term, but it's a sociological term, or one needs time to explain what you mean by class and so on. And then politicians use it all the time, right? Every politician now cares about the middle class, but that's never defined. So we here, and everything I'll show you here to be consistent, when I talk about the middle income group, we take for the year that I'm going to mention, the 20% above and 20% below the average income for that year. That's the middle income group. We define a very large middle, 40% middle. Could have been a third, it could be something else. And they're all legitimate, just that when you do this research, make clear about your terms. And so it's a middle income group, that 40%. And then above it, of course, higher income, and below it, lower income. I'll get some water here. The research is based on a body of literature called the Divided Cities literature. And out of the 1990s, there was this prediction, hypothesis really, that is valid, we find. See, there's always been high and low income areas, as I mentioned, but what is new is the stronger and more rigid divisions between the areas, and I'll demonstrate that on some maps and charts, and the greater inequality among them. And so there's this body of literature that laid the foundations for this research in the 1990s. I normally sort of end with what the processes are. I want to table what they are, and I'll come back and mention them again. But these are the big terms when you have time to write an academic article and the space to write an academic article. You can explain what you mean by globalization, neoliberalism, financialization. You all, I think, have a sense of that. The neoliberalism simply meaning the belief that the more we leave to the market, the better, and smaller government is better than bigger government. Financialization is an interesting one. We know from the world financial crisis in 2007, we switched from being an industrial nation. We used to use the word post-industrial in the 80s. We knew we weren't quite industrial, something else was happening. And it was this financial sort of globalization that was happening. And both then have led, this combination has led to the greater inequality, the gap again between rich and poor, and the polarization, more people at both poles, a much smaller middle group. Now, these are the very big terms. What about the role of regional and local forces? So what I'm going to show you, the trends that aren't very good, I think are explained by these 4 things. Change in the labor market is the biggest one. We switched from, up until the 1990s really, having jobs that were full-time, had benefits, had career prospects, to having way fewer of those, and of course way more part-time jobs, more minimum wage jobs, and this is all part of the deregulation of the labor market, and it's the deindustrialization that has happened to Canada too. So most people work, And a lot of people are not making what people used to make 20, 30, and 40 years ago. I'm the oldest of 6 children, a family of 8, one civil servant job, bought a split-level suburban house, and the family automobile every few years, a new one, the station wagon for 6 kids, and so on, right? And the world is very different now from that in terms of what the housing market, right? So rents and house prices in much of the country going up, but not keeping pace with wages. Right? Discrimination. Yeah, we think, and I'm pretty sure we're better than the United States, but people who live here don't live in the United States, they live here. Housing discrimination, labor market discrimination, educational discrimination. We need to do better to address those things. And finally, something we might first jump on, and it is very important, is cutbacks in social spending. Various transfer payments and tax benefits for low-income people. What has happened in the 90s, though, is the big tax cuts for higher-income people and the big corporate tax cuts that starved the government really of resources. So these 4 things explain the trends I'm going to show you here, and we can talk about these later. And so we use this word urban restructuring because I'll show you in the 30, 40 years, I'm going to show you how differently the city of Vancouver is in the Vancouver region and a bit of comparison with the other geographies. But first I'd like to compare Canada with its comparator nations in a couple ways. And this is the measure of inequality. I picked 14 other countries that in many ways are like Canada, mixed market basically. And I thought the Nordic countries would do better than the Western European countries, and they would all do better than the Anglo-American countries, and that's more or less the case. In the Gini measure here, of course, if a country has down to 0, the smaller the bar graph, the better. If you're down to 0, it means everybody has equal income in that country or that geography. If it reaches 1, it means one person has all the income. Remember, this is now income, not wealth, because wealth is way more unequally distributed, but we can measure, and that's what this does annually, the gap between the rich and the poor in terms of the annual income received here. That's the Gini coefficient. So you see Canada is, not the United States and is not the United Kingdom, but it's not too close to those other countries either. The other important thing is tax revenues. Here we are in one of the wealthiest countries on earth, but we don't have money for things. Transit, keep the libraries open, and bigger things, it seems. Why? Well, this shows why. Nobody likes high taxes necessarily, but if they're used well. I don't know if any of you have been on the transit system in Copenhagen, the buses or the subway. I highly recommend it. They're not cattle cars. So anyways, each 1% of GDP is many billions of dollars in these countries, including in Canada. And we were a few percentage points higher in the recent past, 10 years, 15 years, before all those tax cuts and so on. So we've starved ourselves of revenue. And you see what the United States is doing, and maybe doing worse this month with their tax cuts and all that. And Canada used to do better on this score. Here you see Canada now, the Anglo-American countries without Canada, and then Canada. We were creeping closer to Western Europe, and then moved away in the 1990s. All those tax cuts, they all show up here in terms of the revenue we have to do things. Now, why should we worry about what I'm talking about? Why worry about inequality and growing socio-spatial divisions within our cities? this is the best one-sentence answer I found. Richard Wilkinson and his team, and I think you know intuitively this is true, that inequality promotes strategies that are more self-interested, less affiliative, and often highly antisocial, and so on. We should not be developing a country like that. Now, the same author, Richard Wilkinson, who studies global health and health, compares health outcomes in different nations, his team compiled this composite index. You take, well, good things and bad things, and these are all measurable in various ways, and you make an index. And then, as I showed you, the Gini index of income inequality, you locate where each country is in inequality, and then how they do on that index. So being higher, lower on the index means you're doing better, and being closer to me in that chart is better. So the good news is Canada is right in between the Western and Northern European countries and Japan on this measure. And then the other Anglo-American countries are doing worse. And then you toss in Southern Europe too, Greece and Portugal doing worse on all those measures. A couple years ago when I gave a talk like this in Chicago, I covered up the USA. You can all see USA there, right? Because remember the Republicans going after President Obama, who didn't too often say that the United States was exceptional, right? It's sort of a boasting kind of thing that some people want in the United States, right? Well, the United States is exceptional, so it's right off the line, right? No, and it's extreme. This is quite appalling. And when you look at those things, we know from the news of what goes on in the United States in these things. So we're lucky to be far from that. But we can do a lot better. So our comparator isn't the United States. That's another thing. We too often do that because we're in North America. There's Mexico, there's the United States, and there's Canada. We're doing better than both, but that's not saying much in terms of our comparator nations, is it? So now we'll look at the trends in 4 cities, and like I say, I'll focus because of time limits on Vancouver in particular, and show a little bit more about Toronto because there's some similarities there. And I'll start first with that measure of polarization. Remember, this is where the middle income group is getting smaller. If it is, then the line goes up. And if it was getting smaller, the line would be going down. Now this is what is interesting here is this isn't people. This is census tracts or neighborhoods. You know, there's about 500 census tracts. I think in the Vancouver CMA, there's 1,000 in the Toronto CMA and so on. So this is saying, well, in the 1970s, 1980s, there were more census tracts that fell in the middle income group of census tracts. And over time, in all 4 areas, there were fewer. And you see Montreal changed the least, and Vancouver has changed, but the Toronto and Calgary, and you see in many of these measures, has performed much worse than the other 2 cities. It doesn't mean that the other 2 cities are doing well at all, just that this is quite extreme. And the reason for that, one hypothesis we have on my team, is of course, all these 4 areas have grown in population over this period, and I'll show you a bar chart with population soon. But Toronto and Calgary have grown the most. And so if there's a trend affecting the nation, which there is, it's likely to be seen more and be more pronounced in areas that are growing more rapidly and changing more rapidly. So an area that isn't changing too rapidly will have that trend, if it is national, as Montreal does and Vancouver does, but just not as pronounced. And that is what we're seeing here. So this shows that we are more polarized geographically, so that within each of these metropolitan areas, there are more high-income census tracts and many more low-income census tracts and way fewer middle-income census tracts. And you'll see a map of that shortly. Here we'll look at now the same group of cities, but we're looking at that Gini index of inequality now. And the two charts look sort of similar and sort of similar outcomes, but they are different. They measure different things. And this is simply saying what is the gap between the highest income census tract in each of those years and the lowest income census tract. And the gap has grown in all those countries and took off in the 1990s. You can see the big change began in the 1990s and has kept going. Here is the same chart I just showed you, but you see another city in there, Chicago. And the United States being so exceptional, you would guess that their metropolitan areas the trends would be worse there, and it indeed is worse in Chicago. And in Chicago's case, because we studied Chicago with a colleague from Chicago, and in Chicago's case, the big change came in the 1980s. Remember Ronald Reagan, and in the UK it was Margaret Thatcher. It was really the Chrétien and Paul Martin as finance minister in the 90s that did to Canada a bit of what Reagan and Thatcher did in the 80s to their countries. So then you see Chicago leveling off. And the nice thing about this kind of trend analysis, you ask why, and then you have to know local factors, right? It happens that Chicago is losing population. It's losing African American population, which sadly by definition is generally poor people, right? They're losing low income people, and they're hanging on to their middle income, and they're gaining some high income. Because remember with polarization, if there's a successful big business, corporation, enterprise, the people at the top get paid really well, and there's quite a few professionals near the top also who get paid really well. And then the others, depending on the organization, may not get paid really well. So that's what's going on in Chicago, that it is increasing its high and its upper middle income groups and losing its low income groups there. Now we'll look at Vancouver. I'll show you a few maps, not this many maps, but this is the maps turned into a bar graph. So here you see the population increase in Vancouver, and I'll show you for the other three metropolitan areas shortly. And what you see there, the middle income group in yellow, so yellow on the maps and these things is the middle income group, at 75% roughly, and now is 52%. With the big fall happening in 90, 95, and 2000 for the most part. And so this is showing you polarization, that the high income census tracts, say in 1990, were 16%, and now they've been at 19, 20% in the recent years here. And then the number of low income census tracts have gone up. So what this bar graph does and what the numbers show you is actually the people, like the 481 at the end there, is 481,000 people are in high-income census tracts, being 20% of the city's population. And likewise, that's the way you would read this bar graph. So this is a picture of polarization. If there wasn't, the percentages would be roughly the same or getting better. Now, a few maps. I'm going to show you 1980, 1990, 2000, and then 2015. So the colors are kept constant here, and that measure, remember the middle is always a big middle at 40% above or below the average for that year. Blue, high income, and dark blue, very high income, and then the opposite for low income there. And the way to read this map is to be careful. West Vancouver, the district of North Van, those are very large census tracts. Census tracts have about 4,000 or 5,000 people. So some of the tiny census tracts you have a hard time seeing in the west end of Vancouver there have the same number of people as those big geographies. So the color is a little bit misleading when you get to the more rural areas. So 1980, watch what happens to the 1990, not too much. I'm going to show you the city separately, city of Vancouver separately soon, since it's so tiny here. So we're losing middle income and picking up more of both low income and high income in 1990. We jumped to the year 2000, and so we've picked up even more high and low income, losing more of the middle in that decade. And we jumped the 15 years to the current census, the current data. And there, you see the changes happening, especially in the city, which I'll show you next. But the year 2000 to 2015. Now, remember what you're looking at too is this is the average income for a census tract. It doesn't mean everybody in the census tract is either higher, low, or middle. There can be a co-op there, low income, or there could be a small condo that's high income in there. But this is the average for the census tracts. So this is urban restructuring, who lives where by socioeconomic status. And now the city of Vancouver is interesting. It has the opposite trend of the region. Okay, what happened is that the low-income census tracts and the high-income census tracts have switched places. Low income in 1990 was about 1/3, and now it's about 25%. And high income in 1990 was about 25%, now it's 1/3. And you can see a movement of the low-income census tracts out of the city. So 1990 is the city I remember from the 1980s when I was in Vancouver, the famous east-west divide, high income west and low income on the east. And now it's, the low income is being pushed out. So then this is a reason for what has been announced recently. I know a city housing strategy and actually a 3-year plan, which is then more concrete. I don't know all the details. Can't talk too much about that, but that we need to seriously pay attention to what's happening in the region and the city if we care about having an inclusive city for everybody. So I think you agree these are pretty dramatic trends for Vancouver, but they're equally dramatic for the other three I'll briefly mention. And what is interesting about these four is that each is in a different province. Provinces do matter in terms of tax policy, social benefits, housing programs, or not, along with many other factors. So here we have Calgary, and you see how dramatically Calgary has grown. It is 1.4 million, so the smallest of the metropolitan areas I'm showing you. But it has been a very dramatic growth there. And you know that the economy can be boom bust depending on price of oil and the energy sector and all that. But here, Calgary shifts from being 70% middle income to that 50% level, picking up a lot of low-income census tracts, and hanging on to about the same since the 1990s, 20% high income. In their case. So each metropolitan area isn't going to be the same in the percentages. It depends on many factors, including the history. Montreal has a history of lots of rental stock, and it's still there. And so many factors enter into why there are differences among the metropolitan areas. So Montreal, modest growth, right? Population has increased. And there's not a lot of change there other than that pre-1990s and post-1990s, they too were about 70% middle, but they're about 60% middle now, higher than what we've seen so far. And they've picked up a bit more low-income census tracts, but not that many more. They had quite a few to start with, and they've hung on to them, and their high-income group has stayed about the same, 15, 17, well, 18% of the census tracts in high income there. Now we come to Toronto, and this is the Toronto CMA. Again, the census metropolitan area is what I'm showing you. And a similar trend from 65% middle to 45% middle. But Toronto is so big, you see there's 6 million people now. So I'm going to show you the city of Toronto and then the rest of the metropolitan area. We call it 905, 416 905 after the area codes. So it's, anyways, here is the city, right? Here's the city. And just like the city of Vancouver, something different is going on at the heart of the metropolitan area, which the average for the metropolitan area hides, especially in big metropolitan areas. So again, the city was 2/3 middle income, and now it's 30%, 28%. And it's sort of leveled off around the year 2000, you see, in terms of the low income census tracts at 50%. In the city. Look at the high end, goes from 14% to 21% and keeps on going up. I'll show you 905 in a moment. 905 has hung on to its percentage of high income people, but even though population has grown up dramatically in the 905, the percentage of high income people, census tracts, has remained about the same. So that's saying that high income people are choosing the city versus any new high-income people are choosing the city more than the 905. So here's a population increase in the city of Toronto. They're very, very modest, but look at 905. And 500,000, that's not after World War II, that's not 1940s, that's 1970, 500,000 people around the city of Toronto. It was called Metro Toronto at the time. And now 3.3 million. But here too, from 80% down to, call it 55% in the recent years in terms of the middle income group. And you can see the high income group has stayed the same, 19, 18, 17, well 15 actually in percentage terms, a little bit smaller. In all these bar charts now, think about house prices. Real estate. Who drives market prices? Not low-income people, obviously, right? Middle-income people and high-income people. And so if we go back and look at the city of Toronto and likewise the city of Vancouver, all those low-income people, they're not generating market demand for new rental housing, let alone ownership housing. And who's setting prices? It's those with money in that geography that are setting prices there, as here. Now, just a couple maps of Toronto. 1980, how Toronto's changed, low income, middle income there. 1990, there's more low income, more high income. But then watch the leap to the year 2000, just 10 years. What happened to Toronto. All the measures are the same, the data source is the same. And then jumping to 2015, the map is a little bit worse, but not a lot, right? After that big change in the 1990s. As I said, Chicago had it in the 1980s. So this is spatial polarization. Those high-income areas, and dark blue now, remember, dark blue is what we call very high income there. Their lived reality is just so different from that in the low income parts of the city. And then here is the region of Toronto now, the full region, 905 and the city. So you see to the west of the city, Brampton and Mississauga, are now, that's really high income, low income and middle income, and south and north of the city of Toronto, that's called York Region, Markham, Vaughan, looking like the city of Toronto. So this is happening all over the country, and it plays out slightly differently in each of the metropolitan areas. So I'm getting to a bit of a summary here now. Going to show you what happened to middle income neighborhoods in what I just showed you, and tossing in Chicago in the same measure. Now this isn't the Gini index or anything, this is from those maps and bar charts, and just looking at the middle. So we do here, there's a smaller middle class and all that, and this shows that in fact, right across the country, there are fewer middle income neighborhoods from that high of 65 to 70% to 60 to 40% in those 4 metropolitan areas, with Chicago, as expected, much worse. The decline of the middle there. Now, for you, I've carved up the Vancouver CMA, and only put 5 on there, so it's not too much spaghetti. But the black line is the Vancouver metropolitan area, and we're looking at the middle income neighborhoods only. They were at 70% back in the 1970s, falling to 50%. But each geography has played out slightly differently. And in 4 of the 5 geographies, of course, it's just a loss. It's a decline of the middle income census tracts. And you see in one geography, there's a recovery. That's the city of Vancouver. And I showed you that in the maps earlier, that low income people are being pushed out of the city of Vancouver boundaries, and it shows up in any of these charts. So here we are. What do we do about this? There is growing economic inequality, and it lives someplace, so you see this spatial polarization going on, and people being excluded from certain neighborhoods and certain parts of the region by income, of course. And as I said, that's always gone on, but it's massively going on now. And this is a spatial segregation of people then. And some geographies are more advantaged and others are more disadvantaged, and all that. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet, when you look at the maps with my 3 colors, what determines the color in the census tract? Huh? It's changing over time, right? And the answer is sort of obvious, right? People go look for a place to live, right, or rent. And with income inequality that we always had, but now with more income inequality, money buys choice. So there's a whole group of households that have almost unlimited choice. They could choose to live any place in the region, right? And then there's a whole group of people who have very limited choice. They have trouble affording anything, any place, you see. So those with the most choice are choosing certain geographies, and those with no choice, less choice, end up in the leftover geographies. Not that they're necessarily cheap, but they are cheaper. You know, we're not the United States. We don't have slums of the American variety, which some cities still have, and all that. So it's a dynamic like that that's purely market, purely income. And that's why I talk about the labor market as being a major factor here as to what you're looking at. And I come back to these 4 things that I started with that explain what you're looking at. And provincial laws, federal laws affect the labor market. And then same affect what we do or don't do in terms of affordable housing and inclusive housing, and including mixture of housing and geographies. Likewise, how good are we at dealing with discrimination? That's up mainly to each province, setting the rules there. And likewise, federal, but especially provincial, income support or lack thereof for different population groups. The research has been very clear. Here's John Miles, a very famous sociologist working with Statistics Canada, and you try to explain what I just showed you, and as they conclude here, it was the type of job people are finding and the annual incomes generated that explains the high and low income neighborhoods, and it's quite logical once you think about it. Some countries are way better than Canada at income transfer programs. The tax system and income transfers make up for what the market income does. Market income would be way more unequal than after taxes and transfers. So some countries do much better than we do at adjusting that. I happen to have this chart from Toronto, but the decline in manufacturing jobs, wherever there were once manufacturing jobs, there's fewer of them, and some of them today are almost warehousing or assembly jobs, and many of them are minimum wage now, unlike in the past. Our cities have aging low-rise and high-rise rental, and in some places they're pretty easy to tear down and not replace. Fortunately, the city of Toronto from the 70s on did their best to try to stop rental buildings from either being converted to condominium or torn down. And finally, 10 years ago in legislation, the city was simply given that authority. They don't allow any rental to be torn down or converted unless it's 100% replaced in the same affordable sort of status until there's enough being built. Okay? And we're not going to see that for a while. So policy options, so it's those four big things, as I mentioned before. Now, we had an exercise in Toronto and looking at what the city of Toronto could do. So there's a list of things that relate to our forms of rent regulation and so on, and the list can go on. But all of these things that a city can do will make a difference, but you have to agree they're going to make a little difference for some people. It's those four things, taking good action in those four things, really all three levels of government, but they are mainly the domain of the provincial and federal governments that have the best taxing power to do something. That's where change has to take place. So finally, last two comments. Peter Marcuse, I showed you his book, his year 2000 book about the divided city. In this article, a nice observation, right? Academics will know this, that look around for analysis of power in and over cities, okay? Everything I showed you is done by humans. It wasn't done by an earthquake or a flood or something, right? We did it. Some sort of group of we did these things to the metropolitan areas, and yet there are no studies of really who rules cities and how. And this is public and private power doing these things to the city. So how power is exercised, and then what the impacts are, and how we can better guide the decisions being made. Old timers here and the older academics will know about power elite studies in the 1950s and 60s. C. Wright Mills, Dumhoff, and others did research back then in the local power elites and who was calling the shots and who got to do what with land and development and so on and why. There's very little of that, and we need more of that. I will end by returning to Mark Kingwell, the philosopher professor I mentioned. Nice article in 2008. Urban governance. So what is a just city? He was talking about in that article. A just city demands what? Over and over, that all developments be at some level in the service of everyone. And that clearly hasn't been going on within cities and then to cities. And by that I mean what federal and provincial governments do or don't do to and with cities. So I hope this is informative. It's not a pretty picture, is it? But remember where we stand as Canada doing better than a whole lot of countries that are our comparators, right? Not doing as good as other countries that are our comparators. We can do a lot better. And like I said, the weather or an ice storm or a flood didn't do this to us. We did it to ourselves to restructure cities in this fairly dramatic way. So I will be happy to take questions.